Japanese occupation of the Philippines. The Japanese occupation of the Philippines was a dark and tragic period in Philippine history that lasted from 1942 to 1945. The occupation brought immense suffering and hardship to the Filipino people, who resisted and fought against the invaders with courage and determination. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at the invasion and how it shaped the world. Hello everyone, and welcome to History Declassified. Don't forget to hit the like button, and please subscribe to my channel to ensure you never miss an update on all the fascinating facts related to war in the Pacific we'll be covering. Let's get into it. In the early 20th century, the Philippines was a colony of the United States, which had acquired the islands from Spain in 1898. However, tensions between the US and Japan were growing as both nations sought to expand their influence and assert their dominance in the Pacific region. Japan in particular was eager to secure access to the natural resources of Southeast Asia, including oil, rubber, and minerals, which it needed to fuel its growing economy and military. As the threat of war loomed in the late 1930s, the US and Japan engaged in a series of negotiations and diplomatic maneuvers in an attempt to avoid conflict. However, these efforts ultimately proved futile, and in December 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on the US naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Initial landings. The war began with a brutal aerial bombardment that shook the Philippine capital to its core. The defending troops, composed of Philippine and American soldiers, were under the command of none other than the legendary General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur, who had been recalled to active duty in the United States Army earlier that year, was designated commander of the United States Armed Forces in the Asia-Pacific region. But even his military genius couldn't save his troops from the overwhelming power of the Japanese forces that had descended upon them. Despite putting up a valiant defense, MacArthur's aircraft were destroyed and his naval forces were ordered to leave. With no chance of reinforcement or resupply, the defending forces were forced to retreat to the Bataan Peninsula and the island of Corregidor. Meanwhile, Manila was declared an open city in a desperate attempt to prevent its destruction, but the Japanese were relentless in their pursuit, and they occupied the city on January 2nd, 1942. The fall of Manila was just the beginning of a grueling battle for the Philippines. The defending troops fought valiantly, but the Japanese forces were too powerful, and the US-Philippine forces ultimately surrendered on April 10th, 1942, after a long and brutal campaign. This was followed by the fall of Corregidor on May 6, 1942. Philippine leaders Manuel Quezon and Sergio Osmeña had accompanied the troops to Corregidor, but they later left for the United States to set up a government in exile. Meanwhile, General Douglas MacArthur was ordered to Australia to begin planning for a return to the Philippines, while former President Aguinaldo sided with the Japanese as a collaborator. Initially, the Japanese had planned to appoint Aguinaldo as the president of a puppet state in the Philippines. However, they later gave him the position of National Distribution Corporation head, where he was responsible for rationing war commodities for Japan against his fellow Filipinos. The decision would haunt him for the rest of his life. The horrors of war were not over for the captured US-Philippine forces. Most of the 80,000 prisoners of war captured by the Japanese at Bataan were forced to undertake the infamous Bataan Death March, a grueling 105-kilometer march to a prison camp in the north. Thousands of men, weakened by disease and malnutrition, died before reaching their destination. The survivors faced harsh treatment and deplorable living conditions, and more men died from Japanese mistreatment in the first 4 months in the camps than they had died in their 4 months of battle previously. The occupation. Despite their promise of independence for the islands, the Japanese military authorities immediately began organizing a new government structure, with a Council of State in charge of civil affairs until October 1943, when they declared the Philippines an independent republic. However, the Japanese were not content with just political control. They also implemented a brutal system of sexual slavery, taking more than 1,000 Filipinos, including mothers, girls, and gay men, as comfort women for their military personnel. These victims, some as young as 10 years old, were imprisoned and subjected to unthinkable horrors. The Japanese military installations in the Philippines each had a comfort station, where women were held as sex slaves. Bahay Napula was just one of the many locations where women were forcibly taken and subjected to gang rape, torture, and humiliation. Many suffered injuries, had their breasts cut off, or were killed if they resisted the soldiers' sexual advances. The victims were treated like animals, with many being murdered and disposed of without dignity. In addition to the sexual enslavement of women and girls, Japanese doctors and surgeons conducted grotesque human experiments on their victims. These experiments included amputations, dissections, and suturing blood vessels of live humans, with some victims being forced to dig their own graves before the procedure. Vivisections, the dissection of the stomach, were performed on live Filipinos, with some left with gaping stomachs and intestines spilled out before being dumped in their graves to die. The perpetrators of these heinous acts, many of whom remained at large in Japan until their comfortable retirement, attempted to cover up their crimes for decades. Those who dared to come forward were met with harassment by Japanese ultranationalists who wanted to protect the image of their country. Resistance. Eventually, the Japanese occupation of the Philippines was met with fierce resistance from guerrilla fighters and underground groups. These brave warriors defied the invaders and risked their lives to fight back against oppression, and their efforts paid off. By the end of the war, Japan controlled only a mere 12 out of 48 provinces in the country. But the guerrilla groups were not just a loose collection of fighters, they were highly organized, with commanders who made contact with one another and developed plans to assist in the return of American forces to the Philippines. These commanders gathered important intelligence information and smuggled it out to the US Army, despite the danger and the long waiting periods involved. General MacArthur, recognizing the vital role that the guerrilla fighters played, formed a covert operation to support them. He had Lieutenant Commander Charles Chick Parsons smuggle weapons, radios, and supplies to them by submarine. In turn, the guerrilla forces built up their stashes of arms and explosives and made plans to sabotage Japanese communications lines and attack Japanese forces from behind to assist MacArthur's invasion. Despite the challenges and risks, the Philippine resistance movement continued to grow and gain strength throughout the Japanese occupation. By the end of the war, an impressive 277 separate guerrilla units, consisting of more than 260,000 brave individuals, had fought against the Japanese forces. These guerrilla fighters, often facing extreme danger and harsh conditions, demonstrated a fierce determination and courage that inspired many. As Allied forces advanced towards Manila, Japanese resistance intensified, particularly in the rugged mountains of northern Luzon. Meanwhile, the recognized guerrilla fighter units rose up everywhere for the final offensive, engaging in some of the bloodiest battles of the war. The fighting continued unabated until Japan's formal surrender on September 2, 1945, leaving behind a devastated Philippines. The loss of life was staggering, with an estimated 527,000 Filipinos, both military and civilians, killed from all causes. Among them were between 131,000 and 164,000 who were victims of war crimes, a chilling reminder of the atrocities committed during the Japanese occupation. Following the end of the war, select units of the Philippine resistance were reorganized and equipped as units of the Philippine Army and Constabulary. These units brought with them the valuable experience and knowledge gained through their years of fighting in the resistance movement, helping to shape the future of the Philippine military. The contributions of the resistance fighters to the country's history and culture are an important reminder of the resilience and strength of the Filipino people in the face of adversity. Aftermath. The war left a devastating mark on the country, resulting in numerous casualties and immense suffering. According to a United States analysis released years after the war, the casualties suffered by the US military were 10,380 dead and 36,550 wounded. The number of Japanese dead was even more staggering, with 255,795 reported fatalities. However, the losses suffered by the Filipino people during the occupation were even more tragic. It's estimated that around 527,000 Filipinos lost their lives, with 27,000 military personnel dead, 141,000 massacred, 22,500 forced labor deaths, and 336,500 deaths caused by war-related famine. The aftermath of the war was particularly brutal for the Philippine population. Diseases spread like wildfire, and the lack of basic needs resulted in continuous decline of the population for the next 5 years. This was a far cry from the prosperous and vibrant Filipino lifestyle before the war, where the country had the second richest in Asia after Japan. What do you think about this event? Let us know your thoughts down in the comments section. Thank you for watching our video. Don't forget to subscribe to History Declassified to watch as we investigate more historical events of the finest hours of the Second World War.